Hello, and welcome to the American Writers 100 Pages at a Time podcast. In this episode, I will talk about the second half of Jeremy Zellan's American Lucifers, The Dark History of Artificial Light. In the previous episode, I looked at the book kind of in overall and gave it my overall praise and explored some of its themes and tried to put it in its historiographical context, the context of other historical works that have come out recently. And I talked about the first three chapters in the prologue. So now I'll talk about the last three chapters and the kind of the epilogue, the conclusion of it, of this book. So where would we end up? We ended up with the chapter on coal gas light and the class war and the political battles that emerged around it. And then that leads us into chapter 4, which is one of my favorite in this book. It's one of my two favorite. Chapter 2 and chapter 4 are my favorite here. Chapter 4 is called Lard Lights and the Pigpen Archipelago. So this is about, the use of pig lard to make candles, which, the book starts with candles, obviously, with the discussion of Martha Ballard. But the real center of this chapter is not the candles themselves, but the pigs that were transformed into lard for candles, other commodities as well, and the often enslaved or usually enslaved workers who were involved in this. And this is where we get this Pigpen Archipelago idea, which was it's very fascinating the way Zellan describes in this book, how the Pigpen Archipelago was the series of places that pigs would be taken to in the different processes of being fattened up and then deconstructed into commodities in these kind of rural areas, mostly by enslaved workers, but what am I trying to? I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. But the purpose of it was to disempower the pigs themselves and make them less likely to resist. So a theme here in this book, which I think makes this really, really powerful and impactful and important, is taking the pigs as historical, giving them some historical agency, right? Now, there's a limit to how much we can do that, and we don't want to anthropomorphize animals. I don't think Zellan does. He just acknowledges that pigs resisted with the situation they were in, right? They did this by sometimes refusing to eat, right? So the response to that was culling pigs that when they were piglets would seemingly not get along with the other pigs, and maybe would be a problem, or ones that might, be a little ornery, right? They'd be culled. Another way was this Pigpen Archipelago, which was this like system of step by step, controlling their lives at every moment from birth to death, and it kind of became their life cycle, their work routine, which involved for much of their short life just fattening up, of course, right? And there were skilled workers who were involved in that fattening up process, other skilled workers who would do the deconstruction, right? So again, we get this theme of this capitalism running all the way down through the entire process, from consumption down to production, even when it involved enslaved workers. And that's, of course, a major theme, as I talked about in the last episode, is that in these new histories of capitalism, we're not bifurcating things from like a pre-capitalist or to a more advanced. It's just capitalism just existed in every layer of American life, even in the system of slavery. So enslaved men and women were themselves part of the capitalist system, both as victims. Sometimes they were participating in it on the margins, right, as well. Less so some than others. If you read Edward Baptist, I keep mentioning this book, the Half Has Never Been Told, you see how limited that was. But there's other books out there that talk about the side economy, the market among slaves that might exist, those kinds of things. So the idea here is that capitalism is this much more thorough and intertwined with everyday life system rather than something that existed in a handful of more advanced areas, right? Like in this Marxist view that you have, the example I gave last time too, if you're just joining us, is Eric Williams' old book on how in the system of slavery funded and facilitated the development of capitalism, right? And people, I think, wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but what people like Edward Baptist and I think Jeremy Zellan would certainly agree here is that's true in a way. Yes, the profits of the system of slavery fed into capitalism in very concrete ways, but slavery itself was not a pre-capitalist remnant that was doomed to die out once capitalism took over. That's kind of the old Marxist logic, right? Instead, it was intertwined in the whole system. Now, an important thing that Zellan really emphasizes here is the experimentation and the creativity of these enslavers of both men and animals in maximizing the efficiency of this process, right? Because these lard candles were relatively cheap forms of light. In that sense, it has a lot to do with the turpentine, the camphine lights that we talked about in the last episode. So, the profit margins were narrower, so there was more of a requirement for efficiency and extracting every little bit of surplus value out of the environment and out of the workers who sustained it, right? And really, mostly what we're getting here is a pretty thorough description of the whole process of transforming pigs from piglets to lard candles. And I guess there's not too much to say about it. I mean, along with everything else in this book, as everything is being contested, I think the real wrench here is the animal's agency that's presented here. When you have 1,000 hogs being moved down the road, right? They're not moving very fast. It's slow going. Of course, the capitalists here want to maximize the speed, but that's being confronted. You have conflicts over food and land too, with the local people and between them and the animals and the enslavers of them. You have labor conflict between the skilled workers and some of the unskilled workers, and of course you do have enslaved workers mixed up in this chapter. So that whole process is, the way it's described, is quite well done. It's really just a description of this process. And at the end of the chapter, you get this description of how they took a live pig in about 3 minutes and totally disassembled it into its commodity forms. And that also is kind of it's kind of clinical in a way, but it's written with a lot of sympathy for the victims of this entire process, both human and animal. And it's just hard. It's this is what I'm thinking about when I said before that this book is the closest I've seen in history to something like a horror novel. This chapter really is in the brutal honesty of this process. Now, there's an interesting little epilogue to this chapter too, is how this whole market gets somewhat undercut by new forms, and that's throughout this book too, is how one form of light can be replaced by another form of light, another resource. Overall, the story of the transition from animal to rock oil is key, or in this case, we see the introduction of palm oil as a competitor. And that kind of led to the decline in the use of pigs. But that itself was tied to this global system of slavery and slave labor camps in Africa that were sustaining the palm oil trade. So it's a nice addition at the end of this chapter to remind us of the global system. We get a lot of that. And then it's especially in the chapter 5 where we get really it's literally in the title of the chapter, The Global Violence of Phosphorus. Lucifer Matches in the Global Violence of Phosphorus is the name of the chapter. And this is the most global of the chapters, even more so than the first chapter, which was about sperm whale oil. Because this one is much bigger, right? He actually starts in Britain talking about the match production process, the dipping of the match tips into the phosphorus vats by young workers who were like physically damaged by this. They lost limbs, their jaws were literally rotting. I don't know why that happened. I looked it up, and apparently, this was a pretty common thing, that exposure to the phosphorus would lead to their jaws literally decaying and parts of their body falling off. Phossy jaw, I guess, or whatever it was called. And then not only that, they would glow because of the phosphorus residue on them when they were walking to work. Really, really scary stuff. And of course, you had matches being produced in the United States too. The raw materials for phosphorus, though, were coming from like Latin America, sometimes the guano, on the Pacific coast of South America. There was those big guano reserves, the same thing as they used as fertilizer, I think. And that, isn't that how they brought like the potato blight back to Ireland or something with guano? I think I remember that. And then, but even more commonly, it was just extracted literally from animal flesh again. So you think about phosphorus as just a chemical, right? And kind of neutral that way. But unlike lard, which when you buy it, you kind of like, oh, this is clearly an animal product. It's right on there, right? There's probably a pig on the package of that kind of stuff. But phosphorus, you think, oh, that's just a chemical, right? You don't think of the animal, of it being extracted literally from the animals, right? And it was from cattle in South America, where they would like have to boil down the bones and things to make phosphorus. So we get a very, very global story. And then on the consumer side of things, we get, the question of how matches, easily accessible, cheap matches, affected everyone from enslaved people to free workers, to the working class in general, who had access to this. This had all sorts of consequences, everything from the sabotage. You could easily sabotage bales of cotton with a cheap match that even enslaved people could afford, right? You had increase in the number of fires raging in northern cities because everyone had matches. The term playing with matches kind of pops up in this time period, and the discarded matches all over the city. All these things, just because it was such a cheap form of immediate light, right? It had all these inherent dangers in them, right? And that was never really reflected on. It's a great example of how we introduce technologies. It seems a simple one, right? But we introduce technologies without thinking about the social consequences or the broader consequences outside of the function of that, right? Certainly, we're probably thinking more about this in terms of AI now, right? Should we bring in AI wholeheartedly without actually considering the consequences it'll have on our communities, on our processes of learning, our intellectual property, there's a lot of moral, ethical questions that go into this, but people just sort of embrace it because it's the new thing, right? We never do this with technology. We never do the Amish thing, which is to reflect on, should this technology even exist in our communities? That always comes after the fact, right? It's always STS, science, technology, and society scholars who need to sit back decades later and say, what were the consequences of atomic power? What was the consequence of the atomic weapon? What was the consequences of airplanes on warfare? It's just assumed the new technology should be used without being reflected on. And matches, although very simple, was an example of this because it was cheap and readily available, and it was necessary, of course, for making a lot of these other technologies work, right? You had to light the other lamps, right? So matches were necessary for a lot of these other things to work, but they were so cheap and accessible and dangerous that they caused, these other problems. Another great thing in this chapter, I think, is the description of the factory workers, often children, and how they would have to become ambidextrous. Again, I'm reminded of The Half Has Never Been Told there, where Edward Baptist there talks about how enslaved people picking cotton had to learn to be ambidextrous if they wanted to maintain quotas that were being imposed on them. It seems like match workers had to do the same thing. They were working at almost superhuman speed, putting the wood slides into the machines to be processed into that. It was somewhat mechanized, but you still had the labor process of like setting the matches in there, and that whole labor process is described in a lot of detail. So this is actually one of the better just labor histories. You probably may want to come at this as an environmental history or a history of capitalism, but just as a labor history, this is some of the best writing I've seen in that genre. And this is a good chapter that shows that. But the whole process, global process, from the match dipping to the South American like raw materials to consumption is described quite thoroughly here. And then when these markets have to change, or when these locations of production change, right, that's also described too, right? So we see matchmaking described in Britain, but also moving to the United States, to factories in the United States. We see the shift from using cattle to guano as a way of extracting this phosphorus. So these changes, these shifts, don't change the overall violence of this system of match production. It just kind of gets moved around or focused on different things. We even get here the little match girl kind of story, which is told, where you had the peddlers of matches, who are often children or old people, crippled people or whatever, or people too old to get other jobs and need to supplement their income, would buy matches and sell them for a very small profit on the streets. Maybe, I think it's the story, is it Hans Christian Andersen, The Match Girl? I think it's him who wrote that story. If you probably came across that story, the image of the poor, suffering, impoverished match girl out in the rain trying to sell these little matches to people as they're walking by. That's drawn from life, and Zellan doesn't forget those people, the peddlers, the low-level salespeople, almost tied into like a multi-level marketing scheme in a way, because they were buying matches wholesale from these suppliers and then having to sell them, begging people practically to buy these things. And of course, matches are so readily available and so cheap, that's a struggle in itself to market these products. So then we get to chapter 6, Rock Oil, Civil War, and Industrial Slavery Interrupted. And here's, in many ways, the nub of the argument that Zellan is making, because reminding us of all these different forms of light and all the different labor processes that went into producing it is great. It's really useful. It really expands our knowledge of this time period and the labor systems and the economic systems of that time. We learn a lot from that, but we're still not yet at the argument, because fully in a way, because the narrative that Zellan's grappling with is that there's kind of this teleological development from like sperm whale oil to kerosene and then to electricity. That's the story. That's the story in the textbooks. That's the story most of us get. If you're asked someone on the street, they might be able to tell you that story in some form, right? Like, oh yeah, there used to be gas lamps in the streets. Before that, there was sperm whale oil, and now they're electrical. All right, and now we can light the night sky for no reason, and we can work all night. We have this cheap light whenever we want it, accessible, in almost a post-scarcity sense. And that's thanks to people like Edison, who developed the technology of artificial light using electricity. And we're even more alienated than ever from that. The way he ends this book, in fact, let me jump to the conclusion, to the epilogue, where he writes, this is how he starts it. So he writes this whole book, this whole process, and he says, this is how Americans blinded themselves with light and why it's still so difficult to see. What he means here, again, just great writing, but what he's describing here is how we were blinded of this whole history, this dark history of artificial light, by this progressive narrative, this teleological story, the story we told ourselves of this inexorable positive movement towards electricity, and that these other things are just like bumps in the road to it, and not necessarily contested, not political, not fought out, not contested ground, but just the inevitable development of technology, thanks to a few great inventors, though. They helped it along, but it wasn't a collective process. It just sort of happened, right? And the Civil War, I think most people, if they think about it, they're like, well, yeah, I think this transition to kerosene happened sometime in the Civil War, so it's somehow tied to it. But why? Like, why does the Civil War do this? You might say, well, wars bring technological change. Again, that doesn't quite answer the question of the why, right? We say, oh, the atomic age was brought forth by World War II, but why? There were choices that were made. There was battles over that. There was geopolitics. There was scientific infrastructure that had to be built up. There was a lot going on there. It wasn't just one man or one group of people that did it. And it wasn't detached from political and material realities. So why does the Civil War seem to bring about a transition from these mostly animal forms of light to rock oil, to kerosene? And part of this is geographic, right? That West Virginia was the center of this, right? And the fact that West Virginia seceded from Virginia and stayed in the Union, right, was key. Which, if had the Civil War not happened, right, then you wouldn't have had that geopolitical change within the state borders that would have given these coal operators and these in that region the ability to innovate in this direction. But even that it wasn't just that, free people did this. This actually made this area more contested, as he writes. Coal operators fought back against this geography of freedom, referring to kind of this West Virginia area, many by literally imprisoning the workers they enslaved. The enslaved who were hired to work in channel coal mines alongside free white miners were, according to one historian, maintained in slave quarters when they were not on the job. In Mason County, which faced the Ohio River and was within sight of free soil, coal operators were forced to take extreme measures to prevent their slave workers from escaping. Thus, R.C.M. Lovell confined his hired hands behind stockades after work. The practice of confining off-duty enslaved workers was so commonplace that its absence had to be explained. When asked to testify for a case investigation, a salt furnace explosion, the company owner had to clarify that at Salt Works, the slaves stayed in the cabins 100 feet from the engine when not on duty, but the company did not confine them there and permitted the slaves to run at large. The intensity of surveillance and captivity likely varied from mine to mine and with distance from free soil. Yet there remains little doubt that to combat the alternative geographies of freedom formed by enslaved and free abolitionists working alongside the Ohio River, the owners of the Kaunauna salt furnaces and coal mines tried to make their operations even more prison-like. So you have kind of slavery being maintained there, right? And actually, to be fair, this is talking about the pre-Civil War period in large part, where these industries sort of got their start in the antebellum period. But it was in this borderlands between, as the whole book is describing, borderlands between slavery and freedom in many ways, right? That all of these labor systems are mixtures of them, right? Right, especially with the pigs, the Pigpen Archipelago and the Turpentine Light. This was really mixed between slavery and freedom. I actually came across wondering if one of the reasons why the people of West Virginia broke away from Virginia was because there was more of a market for what they were producing from these coal mines in the North than in Virginia. There's discussion here of how many of them were frustrated about the lack of infrastructure being cultivated by the Virginia state government even before the Civil War. So there might have just been like an economic incentive for them to shift, and the Civil War is going to create that space. Now the real thing happens is that in 1859, that's when oil is discovered in this region. So it was a coal mining area, and it still is, right? It's that western Pennsylvania, West Virginia kind of coal mining area, but oil was discovered here, right? And again, the geography of this and its place in between the slave state of Virginia and Ohio, and it being sort of contested ground already in the coal mines, is going to feed into this new era. But now you have the context of the Civil War too, and this grand political conflict between enslavers and abolitionists and union and secessionism and all these other forces, tearing the country apart. And the center of oil production is going to be like right there at that moment. In fact, he describes how these areas were literally contested during the war, where through raids, the West Virginia area, Blue Ridge Mountains, whatever, was a center of a lot of Confederate raiding and back and forth in the fighting, right? And in the context of this, oil was destroyed, oil was seized, constant guerrilla warfare. So control over these oil fields was never fully established by either side during the war. So the question is kind of asked, then why isn't this just like nipped in the bud? Why isn't this new industry just stopped off to begin with, right? It seems that that's what's going to happen. Just as it started, the region gets mixed up in the Civil War. It's the target of all this fighting. How can you actually sustain a new revolutionary industry of rock oil when you have this geopolitical realities, right? Now, it's at this point that Zellan reminds us, something that readers of history already know, is that the South was not a backwards agrarian state. Yes, it was reliant heavily on cotton exports, which was an agricultural product, and most enslaved people worked in agriculture. But throughout the antebellum period, and even during the Confederacy, there was a movement to industrialize the South in various ways, right? They had their own canal boom. A lot of enslavers, entrepreneurs were developing factories and trying to integrate slave labor into these factory systems. So there's nothing contradictory about investment in this type of industry. In fact, some have argued that had they succeeded in the Civil War, like the Confederacy would have tried to develop a slave-based, racist industrial system, right? And there was elements moving towards that. So what is the ultimate outcome then of the Civil War in this region? That's really what takes up the bulk of the rest of this chapter. Well, what happens is, in brief, is that the Civil War is going to break up the camphene industry, the turpentine industry, right? Because remember, during the Civil War, slavery was itself attacked by the enslaved people, 25% of whom ran away. And of course, their market was largely northern workers, so that's cut off. So the camphene industry is broken up by the war. They didn't have markets in the north, and it just died. I mean, he says by 62, there basically isn't a camphene industry anymore because there's no market for it, right? And then you also have the destruction of slavery itself, right? Which is so crucial to all of this, some of these cheap, light products that were available at the time, like the camphene, maybe like hog oil and other things. Like those were affordable and cheap and sustained by slavery. So once slavery is disrupted, right, you need other cheap forms of, there's a space for other cheap forms of light to fill into that market, and that's where oil's going to fill in, right? So it wasn't a natural progression. That's the main argument here, as I understand it. It wasn't a natural progression from one to the other. Had the Civil War not happened, there's no reason why camphene, as dangerous as it was, couldn't have continued to be a successful, prosperous form of light being provided to people. Horrible, both on the productive and the consumption end of it, but cheap enough to be your dollar store version of light for many, many Americans. Well, you could say, well, what about whale oil? Well, in many ways, it seems that whale oil was already kind of on its way out, maybe due to declining whale populations and things like that. But also during the war, you had Confederate raiding on whaling ships. That was being disrupted as well. So there wasn't going to be a regular supply of whale oil. So what do you have? Imported things, the phosphorus, that's just matches. You still need the oil from somewhere, right? So where's it going to come from, right? And so they find this domestic source, which is coal gas, which was already described a little bit in the earlier chapter, and then eventually the kerosene is going to develop alongside that. So there's a lot here, but eventually kerosene wins out, right? But not for nothing, not just natural, not just because it was better, or not just because someone developed a new technology. It was because of the context of the Civil War that made kerosene the successor. And there's a lot of aspects of it. I didn't even mention all of them. But this is how he concludes. But for the secession of slaveholders, the massive revolt of the enslaved, and the corresponding assertion of demands and power by northern white workers, the landscape of light, labor, and industry may have looked radically different in 1865. In 1861, industrial slavery was coming into its own, and caffeine, coal, gas, and kerosene might easily have become the triumvirate of slavery, industry, and light had Virginia invested heavily in Kawana oil, that's the West Virginia oil, and coal a few years earlier, or if Virginia had remained one state, pulling its western regions into the Confederacy. If the Civil War had been delayed, the Ohio might have combined the labor of both free and enslaved workers into a new trans-Allegheny, Ohio to Mississippi industrial corridor. If the South had won, the postbellum Confederacy wouldn't have been the antebellum South any more than it was the case for the North. A victorious and industrialized Confederacy, even more swaggeringly confident than it ultimately was in defeat, having demonstrated the powerful ability to wage industrial warfare with black slaves and white soldiers, would almost certainly have sought to violently extend this Revolutionary War machine to the Caribbean, the American West, and possibly Mexico and South America, end quote. So we get into a little hinge point history, a little into speculative history, but so important, the reminder here, that in 1860, slavery was at its peak of profitability and power and influence in the United States. It wasn't a dying, declining system that Southern slaveholders were seceding to hold on to as some anachronistic, what am I thinking of the word? Like aristocratic holdovers from Europe, right? Because that's kind of how Genovese writes about them in The Mind of the Master class, right? Is that they were at least, but he's talking about their mind. Maybe in their mind they really were in those Walter Scott novels, right? Ivanhoe or whatever, and maybe in their demented minds that's what it was. But I think the recent scholarship is saying they weren't demented at all. They very much understood that slavery was profitable, it was making them rich, and it would continue to make them rich. And there was no reason to expect that to change suddenly, if not for the destruction of slavery by enslaved people themselves, right? By the Union Army, by Reconstruction, by all these forces, by the power of the state. All these things combined to destroy slavery, therefore forcing a change in the industrial production of light. That's essentially the argument we get here. So anything to say about the conclusion? It kind of sums up a lot of what we've already learned about. Eventually he does get to electricity a little bit here. He kind of stretches the argument forward a little bit to electricity, although he's not making that argument. Like if there's a sequel to this, we could probably have a similar narrative about the struggles, the labor of kerosene versus electrical light, and how that worked out. We can expect it to be, a similar story of contested potentialities. But mostly he uses his conclusion, his epilogue here, to remind us to stop buying into these narratives, right? And just to remember, as he closes the book, it's like when you flip on the switch, you're part of a system, even today, right? A system of exploitation tied to the environment, tied to people's lives with global consequences, right? And there's rich, there's powerful, there's weak, there's exploited, all tied up in light. And I guess you could say, well, isn't that true of everything? Well, yeah, of course. But Zellan here wrote a book about light. If he was writing a book about, clothes, you could probably make a similar case about that. But, I think it's so important that we detach ourselves from this kind of teleological narrative of technological progress. And I think he does that here. I think this is a slam dunk book, to be honest. One I certainly will pick up and read again very, very carefully. So that's, I guess, my thoughts about American Lucifers. You take this episode and the last one and combine them together. We got a pretty, I hope, thorough review of this book. And if you're listening, Jeremy Zellan, I'm really impressed and great job. One of the best history books I've read recently. So what I'm going to do in the next episode is I'm going to stick with history for now because I'm having fun doing it. And it's going to be a slightly different theme. It's going to stick to this period of history, though. But it's going to be Mark Smith's The Smell of Battle and the Taste of Siege, A Sensory History of the Civil War. This will just be a one-episode one-off because it's largely just like an extended essay. It's a little bit over 100 pages. This was written a few years before American Lucifers, and a very different theme. It's not going to be doing an economic history so much. It's really about, how the Civil War smelled, tasted, sounded, and how people experienced senses. I've never read a sensory history, really. I read a little bit of culinary history, but I've never read someone trying to actually get into how, what does it mean if someone in a historical source says that smelled rank? Well, what does rank mean? I have an idea of what that might mean in my context, but in their context, it probably meant something different, right? Just think in terms of personal cleanliness or bad breath or something like that. I imagine breath was much worse in the 19th century than it is today on average because of dental care and, the availability of different products to help us clean our teeth and different social standards about what's acceptable. So also what did the noise of war sound like to people who were used to much quieter environments, right? We're used to noise. If you live in a city, certainly we're used to noise every day and noise intruding. If you listen to my podcast, you might notice my frustration sometimes when the noises of my environment jump into my space. I'm not going to build a soundproof room. Probably should, but not going to. But if you're growing up on a farm and everything's usually very quiet, maybe the sounds of battle are that much more disturbing or frustrating for you to listen to. So I've already started reading this a little bit. I'm going to finish the book probably today, and then in a few days give my thoughts on this book. But like I said, it's a short one. It's just a one episode read. But it should be fun. So anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.